Hi folks, welcome to English 416C Week 3. I'm sorry the lecture is a little bit late this week. However, I wanted to actually take the time to do this in the studio. I didn't have ability to do so yesterday, so I'm doing it today. I wanted to come into the studio because there's a couple of things I actually want to show you in terms of, I've actually got a really good example here that kind of can extend a little bit on some of the things Scott McCloud says. So, understanding comics, the invisible art, is right up there with Eisner's sequential art as a Bible for comics creation and how comics work. And when I was first really getting into comics and really kind of interested in the idea of studying comics academically, I actually took the time to read both of these books, and as well as some other ones. There's actually a really good book about how to write for comics, which is really handy as well if that's something you're interested in doing. And there's been more published since I first started reading them. But this is really kind of one of the classic ones. And one of the things I really like about Scott McCloud's book, and one of the reasons I picked this over Eisner's sequential art, is for the simple fact that McCloud explains how comics work in the form of a comic. And I thought that was a really kind of cool concept. Eisner does it to some extent with using visual illustrations, but mostly it's a written text-based book with images stuck in. McCloud just does a comic, and I think it's a comic that explains what comics are extremely well. So in that regard, we could call this a metacomic or a metagraphic novel because it's really a graphic novel or a comic book about comic books. But Understanding Comics and Invisible Art is just a really cool book, and I think it's got a lot of really useful concepts in here. And I mean, basically, if you can go chapter by chapter, every chapter of McCloud is saying something new and useful to us and understanding how comics work as a medium. And one of the reasons I think it's important we understand how comics work as a medium because understanding how comics work and how they operate and how they communicate ultimately helps us analyze them more effectively. And it's really kind of interesting because these studies of comics in terms of, there's a theory in literary studies called reader response theory. And what reader response theory is, it really is interested in how readers respond to a written text. And so they'll look at, after a reader reads one paragraph, how do they feel about the work? How do they feel after they read the next paragraph? What are the effects those words have on them? And it's really kind of based on operating on how words impact people and how they actually respond to them based upon their given circumstances or context, things along those lines. There's been a fair amount of that in studies of literature. There's also a fair amount of studies of film, what's called film semiotics. It's studying how film works and how kind of film creates the effects in the viewers that it creates, or how film is read and how film is perceived by people. A really classic example of film semiotics is the scene in Psycho, the original Alfred Hitchcock version, where the woman, Janet Leigh, is being stabbed in the shower. You never actually see a knife pierce flesh in that scene. What you see is you see a knife moving up and down, you see blood swirling around in the water, you see the woman screaming, and you also see, I believe you see at certain points skin with a bit of blood on it, but you don't ever actually see a stabbing. What really conveys it is the montage of images that kind of create the idea that someone is being stabbed with the music, which is terrifying. It's a it's that kind of music. It's got kind of a very tense, almost stabbing kind of structure to it, and that's what really conveys the idea that someone's being stabbed. You don't ever actually see anyone get stabbed. So it's a really kind of interesting kind of semiotic effect. It's really kind of illustrates in a lot of ways what McCloud says about closure. But one of the things that happens in comics is we don't have that kind of study really, or in any kind of link that we do here. So if we're going to really analyze comics and really look at how graphic novels work, I think it's really important we take the time to figure out exactly what it is they do and how they're doing it. And I think that's kind of why Understanding Comics is a really kind of useful starting book for us in the class. So let's kind of dig into Understanding Comics. And I actually have a little, there's a cool little thing I want to show you guys that kind of very effectively illustrates why I think this is kind of an interesting discussion. It's the Google. There we go. Oh, I want to get the images. Here we go. Here we go. Okay, so we take a look at this image. Let's view the image. This is one of the, it's kind of an iconic panel in comic book history in terms of just what we might call a comic fail. If you do a Control Z here to zoom a bit. Well, you can look it up yourself. It's Captain America. The line basically goes, Captain America, I command you to, and then the next actually piece of written text is wank. Now, if you know anything about English slang, you know what wank tends to mean. But this is basically what we would call a comic fail. Captain America, I command you to wank is basically what this thing is saying. Now, McCloud would argue that it's saying it in a different term, but the fact that the way the panel is laid out, this is the order of reading that people would actually encounter, says that there's definitely a kind of image and a kind of function of comics that you have to kind of understand if you're going to make comics effectively. And that's a pretty good example, I think, of a comic fail in terms of how we understand comics and how they work. And so let's kind of go through understanding comics. I'm going to kind of touch on just some key points and ideas as we go through this. You practiced this a little bit with the discussion assignment, and I hope that actually worked out for you, and I hope you kind of enjoyed it. I'll take a look at those a little bit later this week. I'm looking forward to see what you come up with. But the first he kind of talks about defining comics, but then he goes into Chapter 2, the vocabulary of comics. And what he talks about really here is the use of symbols. Symbols are actually... he says it's loaded. He likes to use icons, images, things along those lines. But I think ultimately what we are talking about is symbols. And symbols are basically, they are abstractions to varying greater or lesser degrees that stand in for something else. And what he talks about in relationship to comics is he talks about the kind of cartoon face and how the cartoon face stands in for as a symbol of all kinds of faces that lets the reader insert itself in, unlike the way a photograph does, which is a very specific object. And I think you can kind of see that he makes a pretty interesting case for how that works, the idea of a blank slate. Now, I don't know necessarily how this affects us. I would question, McCloud kind of makes the argument that this is the way we feel it is. I would actually question this is how we feel about comics our entire lives. I tend to think as we get older and older and more rooted in our own self-identity, we get a little bit less likely to buy into a particular symbol as representative of us. But I think, especially true of children, if you actually see children watch cartoons or read comics, they really kind of get into the idea of being the characters. But that's also because children don't have any necessarily fixed roles quite yet. They kind of develop those as they get older. So I think in general, the more fixed roles we have in our lives, the less likely we are to kind of buy into that. But I think that there's something that we appreciate there as well, and that's kind of the narrative structure and the kind of images and the kind of way feelings fill in. But I think it's a little bit different than what he's kind of talking about here. But I think the idea of symbol, and the fact that comics don't actually mean anything, they just represent things, I mean, that's kind of an old argument. If you've ever studied deconstruction of literature, that's pretty much the argument there, is, or semiotics in literature, which is that words aren't things. Don't ever hurt yourself with that. But for the most part, this is kind of the same kind of thing you're getting here, and it's a kind of a little bit of an argument about how images work and how structures work and why we kind of appreciate comics and why we connect to comics. And I think to some extent it's rather true. The idea of reality, language, and the picture plane. Language is the greatest abstraction we have. The picture plane is the... and language is really kind of the greatest abstraction with the greatest amount of meaning, or direct meaning. Picture plane is probably the greatest amount of abstraction with the most amount of felt meaning, and reality is the greatest amount of... least amount of abstraction when the meaning is not there because the thing is representing the world entirely. So he kind of goes through the idea of where things kind of fall in relation to comics and things along those lines, and why this kind of works. And I think ultimately he makes a pretty good argument in the first section. For the most part, there really isn't a ton to say about it, but I think the one thing that really does kind of click for me here, that really kind of stands out for me, is the idea of ours as a symbol-oriented culture. And that people are interested in the idea of roles, and I think that's kind of very true. I think the first chapter, comics are rooted in symbols, and we live in a symbol-oriented culture. For example, people really kind of like icons. They like symbols. They like iconography. If you actually study street art and things along those lines, they tend to be very iconic, very symbolic, and that's kind of rooted very much in our very basic belief that symbols are a way that we can represent and understand and kind of, to some extent, tame the world. I think one of the things that really kind of stands out to me as a really good example of MacLeod's argument here that we live in a symbolic culture is the way that people in Anonymous use the V for the Guy Fawkes mask. The Guy Fawkes mask has become a symbol of resistance, and people wear that as a symbol of resistance to authority structures. So I think the way the obey symbol or the onto a giant face that Shepard Fairey used has been used. I think these are all kind of very good examples of the fact we are very much rooted in symbols, and I think one of the reasons today that we have such a popularity of comics may not entirely be simply because of superhero movies and things along those lines. I think it might also be for the fact that we are more and more interested in symbols than we have been. We live in a very image-based culture. Most of us spend our time on our phones looking at images, reading text, but images really kind of drive a lot of what we do in terms of our social interaction. And I think comic books are actually a storytelling medium that's very much rooted in images, and I think that appeals to us to a great degree. So I think the idea of comics being rooted in symbols, I think, is symbol-oriented culture is a really interesting one. I think we get to the really kind of interesting stuff in Chapter 3, that blood in the gutter section, where he talks about the idea of closure. The idea of closure is a really fascinating one, and I think it really kind of explains all medium have a relationship with the viewer and the reader to a certain extent. They have a relationship to the audience that is mutual and open. And I think that's really kind of where the idea of closure comes into play here. When we read text, especially when we read stories, we tend to recreate the images that we actually read in our head, and we kind of give them a 3D life and a sensitivity and senses and sounds and things along those lines. And we also fill in the gaps between things in the story. So for example, one of the things that happens in stories is when we read a story, if we have mainly human characters, they never actually describe them taking a crap. But we assume that they do. We assume they're fully rounded human beings. We're adding closure to that character to round them out as a living, breathing individual that's really not there necessarily in the story. And I think a lot of the times when we are reading stories, when we're kind of building those worlds in our head, we're giving those things life, we're actually going beyond what's written on the page to kind of create that world. And what really we put on the page in a story is we put on the page what the reader is going to need to be triggered enough to create that world in their head, or create some version of that world in their head. There's always going to be a variation in it, of course, but I think MacLeod is really kind of looking at what we do with text and how we kind of build those things in our head is what we do with comics, and how we do that in our head. And he talks about the spaces between panels is the places where we're kind of creating that closure. And when we figure out how that closure works, and we kind of fill in the gaps between panels. And he kind of talks about how movies give us the 24 frames per second, and he kind of argues that literally when you're doing comics, you're taking and cutting little bits out of the movie, or like an idea of a movie, and you're kind of letting it fill in the gaps there. So he talks about subject to subject, action to action, scene to scene, and he goes through a really cool litany of different ways that comic panels work and different kinds of closure we find and we encounter when we read comics. And I think it's a really kind of cool idea, and he kind of maps out how they're used and things along those lines. I think one of the things he points out is the more and more of the if you have a whole book of non sequiturs, at a certain point it actually stops feeling like a narrative. If you have too much scene to scene, it also stops feeling like a narrative. It starts feeling disjointed and weird, and it kind of creates pacing issues and things along those lines. And one of the things I'd like to point out here that he does bring up in this book, and I think it's worth mentioning, is the history of Japanese comics and the history of European and American comics are fundamentally different. Japanese comics in many ways have a very different language than we do, and also Japanese comics had an adult readership for a far longer period than American comics do, so they are significantly different from American comics. One of the things that happens is when American comics get more sophisticated in the 80s and 90s, a lot of the comic book writers and authors are actually reading Japanese comics and picking up the language that they're using in those comics. So there kind of becomes parts of that kind of get worked into that. And I think he does a really good job here of pointing out how this idea of closure works and how it's important, the visible and the invisible, the relationship between the two. Then he talks about how time works in comics, and I think time is a really interesting concept in comic books. because it exploits our sense of time, which is actually quite arbitrary. And I think a really good example of that is when he talks about the first panel. Now, when we read the first panel on page 95, it might have a really different than I do. It's the party scene that he does right after he introduces the new section. You've got the blinding flash. You've got the people sitting on the couches and talking, things along those lines. There are two ways you can read this panel. If you're reading it left to right, your natural inclination is to think these things are happening in order. However, you could also read this and say they're all happening at once. And I think one of the cool things the panel does is it points out that how we perceive time is very much rooted to how we perceive information. So the fact that we can't take in an entire scene at once, to some extent, kind of breaks up scenes and kind of creates a sense of a passage of time even within a scene. But I think he's also kind of making the point here that you could also try and read this as a single moment. And one of the things that kind of comes up when you read comics is what do people see first in the page? How do they interpret that? Things along those lines. And he does a really kind of cool job of talking about how time is used in a comic. And I thought that was really kind of useful and helpful information, because I think comics really do rely on the fact that we are deeply rooted in the sense of time. And we are deeply rooted in the sense that time passes. We don't have to be told that time passed in a comic necessarily. In some cases we are if there's a multiple-week jump, but sometimes we're not told that at all. And we just know that time passes from reading in visual cues, and we understand how time passes in a comic. I think it's a really kind of cool idea, because it points out how rooted we are to our own perception of time. When he talks about the living in line, I thought that was a really good chapter as well, for the simple fact that he points out very, very effectively how certain lines can be used to create sensations. And it can be done so to a degree of abstraction. And I think that's a really kind of cool thing to discuss, and a really kind of cool thing to point out about how comics do that. And I thought that was one of the things I really like about that chapter in particular, is that he makes comparisons to serious expressionist and artists and modern art, and how modern art uses line and how comic books use line when he uses the stink sounds and things like that. And I think it's a really kind of cool effect to bring those two things together in a really kind of interesting way. And one of the things I think that's worth mentioning is that really when he's talking about how line is used by the expressionists and Kandinsky and things along those folks, what he's really kind of talking about is a move away from representational art to a significant degree. They're interested more about the art of how things feel in terms of lines and structures, and how different kind of maybe not necessarily realistic symbols can create an emotional impact. And I think when he brings it into comics how that works, I think it's kind of really kind of cool and effective. And he does really kind of point out how styles work, and I really like on page 126 how he goes through the different styles and how they kind of really create sensations and feelings. And I've always noticed with some of my favorite comic artists that I like their work better on some things than others. Some artists have a very strong superhero hand. They write beautiful superhero work that really fits superhero genres, and then some, for example, have a hand that fits very kind of odd and underground stories and different kinds of stories, and I think that's really kind of telling. And I think one of the things we'll kind of encounter as you go through the class is when we read Alison Bechdel and when we read Daniel Clowes and things like that, is they have a very distinct visual style that fits very well the kind of stories they tell. And I think that's a very kind of worthwhile thing to take a look at. And I think if you're really looking for a great example of that in current times, one thing I would really recommend taking a look at is I would take a look at the work of, the book is called My Favorite Thing is Monsters. It's probably one of the best graphic novels that's come out in the past 5 to 10 years. I didn't include it in the syllabus because it's an expensive book. I also didn't include it in the syllabus because of the simple fact that it's kind of repeating what we cover with Spiegelman and things along those lines. And the reason I stuck with Spiegelman is because Spiegelman was kind of the first. And we do it with Bechdel, and I mean Bechdel's won the National Genius Award. It's a new book. It's a fantastic book. It may not have received the acclaim it deserves, and I kind of wanted to go for a breadth of things, different kinds of genres and topics you could cover, as opposed to really digging looking into one particular type of book. But it's an autobiographical comic with representational things along it, and it's a kind of narrative structure. It's an amazing read, but the story, I believe it's Emil Harris is the name of the author and the illustrator, and she does an amazing, astonishing job of just producing a beautiful comic book where the style matches perfectly the images and how painful it creates a wonderful effect. I'd really recommend checking out My Favorite Thing is Monsters, because I think it's a great illustration of what he's talking about in this chapter. Okay, so there's some really kind of interesting stuff about how images and things along those lines work. The show and tell thing that he kind of talks about is, this is kind of a throwback to if you were taking creative writing with me, is the way that images create meaning in comparison to words create meaning. And I think one of the things I really like about comics as a writer, from the perspective of a writer, is I actually really like to see the interrelationship between words and image and how they can counterpoint each other, how they can work together, how they can separate with one another, how they can diverge. I think there's really kind of interesting stuff in that, and that's something I would really recommend taking a look at and spending a time with when you're reading through our books, is look at how the words and the images are coming together and how they're playing together on the page, because I think it's a really kind of interesting concept. I think if you take a look at our Captain America wank, this is a problem with not understanding how image and words work together. So here we have an image that's particularly planned, but then the letter comes back, does this, and it messes up the entire perception of the panel. It becomes, in many ways, kind of a visual gag as opposed to an actual action-packed, loaded comic book panel in the actual story. So then he talks about the 6 steps, and I think for those of you who are in the arts or interested in the arts, I think the 6 steps is a really kind of interesting concept, because it talks about the idea of idea, purpose, form, idiom, structure, craft, and surface. And I think when he reverses the concept to talk about how we appreciate art and how we learn about art, I think the fact that he starts with surface and then builds into craft, structure, idiom, form, things like that, is really kind of brilliant, because I think that's where he's looking at kind of an artist's progress, how artists actually approach artistic works. And I think one of the things we do as critics of literature, and one of the things we do as writers and producers of literature and art, is we actually follow this structure. We start by reading things in surface, and then we get more and more knowledgeable about how things are read and how things are perceived, and we start looking at craft. How is it written? How is it put together? How is it drawn? Then we look at the structure. How is it overall? How is it working at an organic overall level? Then we look at the idiom. What's it trying to do? What's the actual school it's kind of coming from? What's the beliefs here that it's coming from? What's the form? Is it a different kind of form? We start kind of playing with these things. And the deeper you go back into this, the more kind of radical and innovative results you get from the artists who do kind of explore these things. And I think it's a really kind of cool concept. I think it's a great way to kind of explain how that works. One of the things I think is really kind of handy about this, and I'll probably start using it in some of my other classes, is I think this is a really kind of sharp explanation of how artists should go about approaching other art, especially if they're trying to learn about it, or how they're going to approach their own art and understand their relationship to that art. I think it's kind of a good kind of graph structure for it. Then he talks about color. Color is actually becoming more and more comic in comics from even when the time he wrote this. When he wrote this, there were significant amounts of black and white comics sold. There are less and less of those every day, thanks to the lower cost of getting a comic colored. The other thing that's kind of going on with color is that there are more and more, and this is kind of, I think he addresses this later on in one of his medium comics, thanks to things like Photoshop, Adobe Illustrator, and all of the different kinds of digital painting programs that are out there, there is significantly more nuanced color in comics than there ever has been. Comics, in many ways, one of the things that's been happening recently, there's a particular comic illustrator I like named Tula Lotay, who actually exhibits her comic book covers and things along those lines that she draws, because she's actually a fine artist who ended up kind of wandering into the field of comics. And I think that's happening more and more as the techniques of fine art are being incorporated into comics and the expectations for the quality of art in comics goes up. And I think there's still room for people like Robert Crumb and things along those lines, and for the black and white underground comics, but more and more the expectation is that people are going to make use of the materials out there. And comics in particular have grown significantly artistically over the years. And partly it's because of that kind of horrible 1990s Rob Liefeld thing and Todd McFarlane and all those folks. But artists, and it kind of goes back and forth in comics, who is the most, what sells the book. Is it the art or is it the writer? Most writers and artists will tell you it's the two things work together and you can't take them apart no matter how much you want to. But I think the art has improved over time, and so has the writing, and I think that's one of the things that kind of is worth mentioning here in this color section in particular, is how color and commerce kind of play into it. But the fact that it's becoming cheaper and cheaper to color comics very, very well, to the degree that you would expect to see in large-scale commercial produced art, or even in fine arts, it's overall driving up the overall expectation of the quality of the comic. And I think one of the things that kind of I was reminded of when I was reading through this section, the idea of commerce and art, and the kind of the way commerce and technology and art and the way they kind of come together. I was kind of reminded of a really good quote by an author named Warren Ellis, and what Ellis said was, commercial art can be sublime. And I think that's a really kind of concept, an important concept to think about, and I'm going to put that down here too. And I think in some ways this will serve, or should serve, as kind of an opening premise for the rest of the course. Because for all intents and purposes, graphic novels are commercial art. They are made and meant to be sold. They're meant to have readers. They are not necessarily, to the degree of some other works, someone's private little heart that they're locking up in a box somewhere. They're pure art, but they also have commercial purposes, because most of the people who are selling these books are hoping to communicate, and they're also hoping to kind of earn off the books to some extent. So but the idea that commercial art can be sublime, I think, is a really important one for us to keep in mind, especially when we analyze works of literature, and especially when we analyze art and things along those lines. And the example that Warren Ellis used was that some of the advertisements for cafes and bars in Paris in the late 19th century were some of the best art in the late 19th century. They were beautiful paintings and beautiful illustrations. And he said those were some of the best art that came out of France in that time period. And I think that's ultimately kind of true, is that commercial art can be sublime. And we should keep that in mind, to not dismiss anything necessarily out of hand. The Watchmen was a very well-selling graphic novel. Does that somehow make it less than maybe Ghost World? I don't know. I think that's something we're up to debate. But I think the idea that the commercial and the sublime can kind of work together, I think, is a really kind of important thing to keep in mind going forward. And the last thing he kind of talks about is the different ways and the different explorations and the futures of where things can go. And I think that idea of expressionism and aesthetics, and the way we kind of make comics real in our heads by hearing the noises, reproducing the sounds and the sensations of things, all of this stuff is really useful information for understanding how comics work. And what I brought today, before I kind of close things out, that I wanted to show you, is I want to show you Alan Moore's Promethea Book 5. So I'm going to bring up the document cam here. And unfortunately, this thing is kind of crap when it comes to anything that moves at any kind of particular speed. Let's see if I can get it to zoom out a little bit. Okay. So this is Promethea by Alan Moore and J.H. Williams III. J.H. Williams III, it's worth mentioning. Alan Moore you're going to be reading for next week for The Watchmen. And Alan Moore is probably considered one of the greatest living comic book writers. I have disputes about whether there are people better than Alan Moore out there. My argument would be yes, but that's partly because Alan Moore's kind of a pompous ass when it comes to a lot of things. But I think Alan Moore is definitely worth kind of looking at, because he does do some very experimental and interesting things with the work. J.H. Williams, who was the full run artist on Promethea, is a fascinating artist of superhero comics. Some of the work he's done in superhero comics has really pushed the boundaries of how superhero comics are designed. One of the things that J.H. Williams really likes to do is play around with panel sizing and placement. He'll have panels that flow into other panels and other pages, and they have a kind of weird organic unity to them that are kind of really beautiful and effective, and it almost kind of creates a sense of that somehow the time in between panels is almost living in a weird way. And I think there's a really kind of cool work he does here, but there's one of the things he does, and I absolutely love this in Promethea, is the last issue of Promethea. And Promethea is a story that's really rooted on the ideas of magic and a lot of the kind of hermetic magic or old hermetic practices that Alan Moore was interested in. Promethea, if you take a look at the page, this is the cover, this is the first page, this is the second page, and this is the third. If you see kind of these interweaving lines I point to here, one of the things that's really interesting about this book, and I have tried this, I know for a fact it works, is you can reorder the pages in any particular way you want, and the story is going to make sense. The images make sense, the flow of them makes sense, the story makes sense, the details make sense. All of it works as a non-sequential. You can reorder the sequence entirely as you see fit as the reader, and as long as you follow and don't try and break down the individual page, it works perfectly. And it's a fascinating example, I think, of what McLeod was kind of talking about when he talked about innovation and exploration and change in the use of in comics and how comics are used. It's a brilliant game of form and structure, and it kind of in some ways breaks a lot of the idioms of comics in the sense that when people read comics, they read left to right, top to bottom, and they read in the order of pages. Here, the fact you can reorder things entirely makes a significant difference, and I think it's one of the things that really stands out to me about this book. All right? But, like I said, I don't have a lot of analysis to provide necessarily in McLeod, because McLeod really, for the most part, provides his own analysis very, very effectively. I think it's a clear, cogent reading of comics and the medium and how they work. I'm fascinated to see how you guys applied it to the comic books you took a look at. But I think one of the things we should look at and think about when we're reading through the books we're going to be reading through this semester is think about how these techniques are working to create meaning, how they're impacting you as the reader, and how the artist and the writer are, or who might be the same person, are structuring that comic to have those effects. Because I think that's the same thing as looking at the specific wording in a narrative, because and ultimately kind of deciding how a narrative works based on that. So, as for this week, if you go ahead and you take a look at the module, you're going to see that this week you're going to go ahead and watch this lecture, and then you're going to read The Watchmen. Hopefully you guys started on that last week. It's a long book. You don't necessarily need to worry about the Black Freighter sections. I know I'm not a good comic purist by telling you that, but it really kind of feels to some extent you're reading the Black Freighter story like you're just getting whacked over the head with a story that's part of a story. And I mean, that kind of stuff is lovely for postmodernism, which in many ways The Watchmen is. But I don't know if it's necessarily the best way of your time. If you're pressed for time and you've got to get the book done, skip the Black Freighter stuff and really just focus on the story. But I want you to read The Watchmen. And Discussion Response 3 kind of addresses some issues in The Watchmen. So what it is one of the things The Watchmen's been kind of applauded for doing, or in some cases accused of doing, is kind of breaking down the archetype of the superhero. It kind of takes superheroes and twists them a bit and kind of adds depth to them and kind of psychological depth and kind of a moral fallibility that superhero characters didn't usually have. And it also kind of does that by matching them to various particular kind of certain superhero archetypes. The example I use is Dr. Manhattan in many ways is meant to be a counterpart of Superman. There are actually direct correlations between characters that existed in early comic books. DC Comics, somewhere I think in the 1940s or 50s, bought a company called Charlton Comics, or Charleston Comics, and Charleston Comics had their own kind of batch of superheroes that were kind of a rip-off of other superhero characters that DC and Marvel were doing. Alan Moore, when he originally approached DC about doing The Watchmen, asked if he could use those characters as the characters of The Watchmen. DC said no, so he created counterparts and analogies to them. So you get these kinds of characters, but they're kind of classic comic book characters that he kind of twists and turns in their heads, and there's kind of connections to them. So for example, Dr. Manhattan's kind of a counterpart of Superman. You can make an argument that Rorschach, in fact, to some extent, represents kind of a twisted version of Batman. But I think looking at what I want you to do is kind of compare how these individual characters in The Watchmen are twisting and turning superhero archetypes in their portrayal in The Watchmen. So what I'd kind of like you to do is pick one of the major figures from The Watchmen, pick one of the main characters, and then look at how they differ from and share the similarities from the traditional superhero figures. Since we're going to be posting these so everyone can read them, it'd be really, really cool if each of you did a different superhero, tried a different character out of the book and saw what you could come up with. I think that might be a cool thing to do. I'm not going to make it mandatory, but it'd be appreciated if you do kind of flow off each other to some degree, because I think you could get some really kind of interesting interpretations. I think at the end we'd have a really kind of cool collection of how all of these characters can work together and kind of take a look at how they're all kind of different, how they're twisting it, and then will kind of give us a cool summary of them. So that's what I want you to work on this week. Make sure you have Watchmen ready for next week. Next week I'll dig into the Watchmen. Hopefully the lecture will be a little bit sooner in the week next week. But if you have any questions or concerns, let me know. Otherwise, take care, be well, and I will talk to you folks again in 7 days. Thanks for hanging in there, and thanks for and I hope you're enjoying the class so far.